Welcome back to the IEA's podcast Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week we're looking at the forgotten giant of electricity, hydropower. If I ask you to think which renewable energy source generates the most power, wind or solar might come to mind. But it's neither of those. In fact, hydropower produces about as much power as the two of them combined. It outproduces nuclear by 50% and it's the third biggest source of power behind coal and natural gas. So why, as electricity demand hits record highs, isn't hydropower higher up the energy policy agenda? Here to discuss its untapped potential and its challenges is Yasmina Abdelilah, renewable energy analyst at the IEA.
Okay, Yasmina, thanks for talking to us today. Now, Fatih Birol, who's the IEA's executive director, now he called hydropower the forgotten giant of electricity. So maybe you could give us your thoughts on why hydropower can sometimes be left out of conversations on energy.
So that's a really interesting phrase, and that phrase was developed to capture the fact that hydropower plays a major role in power systems today, but relative to this role that it plays, it gets a disproportionate amount of policy attention. So hydropower is actually the third largest source of power generation today. So it's behind coal and natural gas, which effectively makes it the largest form of low-carbon power generation. So it plays a very important role in the power system in terms of generation, but it also plays a very important role in terms of providing power system flexibility. Power system flexibility is the ability of a power system to respond to variations in supply and demand. And with the increasing share of PV and wind in the system, we're going to need that more and more. So hydropower can ramp up and down quickly in terms of pump storage. It can store electricity. So it's a major form of power system flexibility, but also generation. And so those two roles are very necessary for energy transitions, but also for electricity security. But relative to this really important role that it plays, it's not getting equal amounts of policy attention.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to unpacking some of those themes that you were talking about. But just before we go any further, I think it's worth reminding people exactly what hydropower is, because there are also lots of different types of hydropower. So maybe you could just explain what we're talking about.
Yeah, so basically hydropower is water flowing through a turbine, which then turns a generator and produces electricity. And the amount of that electricity depends on the volume of water going through the turbine and how fast that it's going. And that speed of the water going through the turbine can be determined by the natural flow of the river or from water falling from a certain height, and it's the potential energy that affects how fast that water flows. And you've got about three basic types of hydropower, run-of-river, reservoir, pump storage, and the difference between those three basically boils down to how much you can control the water and the amount of electricity coming out of that. So run-of-river plants depend on the flow of the river going through, and there's relatively little storage associated with them. So the amount that you can control is relatively little in terms of the amount of time, just a few hours of the day, up to 1 day max. So conversely, reservoir hydropower is a large reservoir where water is stored behind an impoundment, which is usually a dam. And the amount of electricity that can be generated can be controlled over not just hours and days, but also weeks, months, and even seasons. So you have quite a lot of control in the reservoir hydropower projects. And then you've got pump storage, which is different. It's not for baseload power. It's like a giant water battery where you consume electricity when there's excess generation, pump water from a lower elevation up to a higher elevation, and then release that back down whenever there is periods of high demand. So you've got even more control over how much generation, because you can decide how much you want to pump up.
Okay, so that's how it works. And maybe you could just tell us about some of the benefits of hydropower, some of the unique points that this energy source has compared to some other sources of energy.
Well, It's a large source of low-carbon power generation, and it's also a low-carbon source of power system flexibility. And this is really important, not just for energy transitions or for countries trying to achieve their climate goals. It's also extremely important for electricity security. And then I would say also, actually, there is one particular characteristic about hydropower, particularly reservoir hydropower, is that a lot of these infrastructures were also built for other water purposes, so for irrigation and navigation and flood control. So it's actually quite an interesting technology because providing power is not the only function of these plants, but to perform other water services as well.
Okay, now let's move on to geography. So tell me which countries or parts of the world that have the most hydropower capacity.
So that's a good question. Actually, hydropower is one of the world's oldest power generating technologies. The first plants were built in the late 1800s in Europe and in North America. And those regions continued to build out hydropower much throughout the 20th century, all the way up until about 1990. In fact, 70% of the world's fleet by that point in time was in Europe, North America, and some of the mature markets in Asia Pacific. But then around 1990, we saw growth plateau in those markets. And there are two reasons for that. The first, a lot of the low-cost economic sites had already started to be tapped, so it became more complex and more expensive in these markets. But also, this was the time in which a lot of electricity markets started to liberalize. So the revenue certainty that developers had started to diminish, and therefore becomes more risky. Now, just because growth started to plateau in these more mature markets doesn't mean globally growth stopped. In fact, it just moved to places where you still had economic potential. And so that became the emerging markets. And so actually, since 1990, 80% of new hydropower development comes from emerging markets, with China accounting for about half of that. And so now, basically, hydropower is quite ubiquitous. Almost every single country has hydropower today. There are a few exceptions, places like Singapore, for example, because of urban density, or places where there are water-scarce regions like Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East. But apart from selected countries, hydropower pretty much exists everywhere. So it's quite a global technology. But having said that, about half of today's capacity is just in 4 countries. So that's China, United States, Canada, and Brazil. You still have other countries with large fleets like Russia and Norway.
Okay, now a little earlier you were talking about the age of the hydropower fleet. Now, maybe you could just tell me about if that creates any problems and what solutions are there to a hydropower plant that may be decades old?
So actually, hydropower plants have a long technical lifetime. Dams can last up to 100 years, and the electromechanical equipment can be a few decades old. And that's a good thing. They're designed to run a long time. And so because they're designed to run a long time, and they do run a long time, the average age of the fleet right now is about 31 years old, which is higher than other renewable technologies. If you unpack that a little bit, though, you'll see that that really masks two very different populations in terms of the age of the fleet. The more mature fleets, Europe, North America, those fleets are about 44 years old. But then conversely, on the other side, you have the emerging markets that have much younger fleets. So China, for example, average age of the fleet is 16 years old. So you have a wide range. And when you're dealing with these older fleets, though, at some point in time, you're going to have to make a decision about whether or not to make the major investment to keep that plant running. So like a car, up until a certain point in time, you can make small repairs relatively cheap. But then at a certain point in time, you have to make a decision. Am I going to, make the investment to keep this thing running? And that's where it becomes a bit tricky in these markets because that decision now has to be made in an environment that was very different than when those plants were first built. And that speaks to the fact that these markets are now liberalized, so you do have shorter visibility over those revenue streams. And they also don't remunerate now for those system services or that system flexibility that hydropower can provide. And so governments have to then make sure that they are providing sufficient incentives and an enabling environment so developers can continue to refurbish those fleets. And you've got examples of that, like the United States, for example, has tax credits not just for new power plants, but they also have an incentive to modernize the existing fleet. Switzerland provides incentives for the system services that they provide. And France, for example, when they're renewing their concessions, they also provide some economic benefits there to make sure that they modernize those fleets.
Okay, let's have a think about expansion. A bit earlier, you mentioned the potential for developing markets or emerging economies. So maybe you could just tell me a bit more about that. What is the potential there and what countries or regions are targeting it?
So for greenfield projects, which is a plant developed completely from scratch, so 100% starting construction from start to finish, the emerging economies that still have large pipelines for that would be China, Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's untapped potential, and Ethiopia and Nigeria. Asia, we still see a lot of greenfield growth, particularly India, Nepal, Vietnam, Laos. And the drivers in these markets, one, is that there's still untapped economic potential lying there, but also it's the lowest cost form of power generation in these markets to meet the needs of the fast-growing power demand, but also for providing electrification. So electricity access is still an issue in some of these countries, and hydropower can provide large centralized power in these markets, or they can be developed in mini grids for rural communities. And in some of these markets, actually cross-border power trade, so getting revenues from trading to your partners, also is an area that they see as part of the economic development of the country. But it's important to point out that new turbines, new megawatts and gigawatts is not just limited to greenfield projects in emerging economies. In the more mature markets that I was speaking about earlier, Europe, North America, parts of Asia Pacific, you can still get additional power in these markets. And that would come from powering existing infrastructure. So that's a trend in the United States right now where you've got existing dams or infrastructure and waterways. And you can put a turbine on that and turn it into a hydropower plant. And this ends up being less costly than a new plant because the construction is already done for the most part. The infrastructure is already there. Permitting is less complicated. And then pump storage as well. So actually, when you look at the pipeline globally, half of the global hydropower pipeline right now is pump storage plants. And that's very different than it was a few decades ago. And that's because pump storage has something to offer for everyone, not just for integrating variable renewables, so PV and wind in markets that have high share of that, but pump storage also provides that power system flexibility that's needed for fleets that have coal and nuclear. Because when there's periods of low demand, ramping down those coal and nuclear plants and then ramping them back up is actually quite costly. So having pump storage there helps run those fleets cost effectively.
Okay, let's think about the financing, the funding, because these are big projects. So can the private sector get these projects off the ground on their own, or do you ultimately still need the state as a backstop for the state to get involved in some way?
So that's a really good question. And what we've seen when we look at the data is that it actually more and more depends on the size of the plant. So the private sector tends to be more involved or own smaller plants. That's because they are less complex to build, require less permitting, and therefore are less risky. There's also more incentives that are available, such as feed-in tariffs for smaller plants. But the bigger the project gets, the more complex it gets, the higher cost that it gets, and then the more stakeholders that are involved. And that's where you start to see ownership shift more to the public sector or state-owned utilities. It's not to say that the private sector is not involved in these larger plants. There are mechanisms and pathways in which private sector can be involved. A lot of times now in emerging economies, you will see public-private partnerships emerging, and that's where the risks are allocated to the stakeholder that's best placed to shoulder them. So as long as the business case is viable or the public sector can create an enabling environment, either by being involved or providing financial incentives, you can still have the private sector involved in large hydropower plants.
Okay, now there are other challenges associated with building projects on this size. So can you talk to me about some of the issues that people need to think about, some of the roadblocks that people need to overcome when they're building hydropower projects?
So as we said, hydropower offers a lot of benefits, but it can be a very complex technology to build. Hydropower plants are not a one-size-fits-all. They're very specific to the geography, the water, the precipitation that is specific to that topography. So because of that, they can be very, very complex to build, and they can have very long lead times. This comes from having to scope out the right site, do feasibility studies to see if the project is profitable. The environmental permitting sometimes can be a long process. Sometimes there's social opposition or local acceptance issues if that project isn't built or developed sustainably, which we see becoming less and less of an issue because you do have several frameworks to develop hydropower sustainably. So developers do have access now to guidelines to help ensure that those impacts are minimal, both to the environment and the community. And as long as they get stakeholders involved early on, that should be minimized, which then also reduces the lead time of those projects. But aside from just developing the hydropower projects, which can be long and costly sometimes, there are some economic challenges, and I've touched on those before. One, some of the projects are high upfront capital cost, uncertain business case and revenues in the liberalized markets, especially when the services aren't remunerated. And then sometimes there can be some challenges over properly valuing the project, especially when there's multiple water services that are involved. That can involve multiple institutions or, services that are not monetized. So that can make the business case a bit challenging.
Okay, now let's end by looking ahead, because we've spoken about some of the issues with the current fleet and some of the solutions as well. But if those are addressed, where could hydropower be by 2030?
So right now, our latest forecast sees the existing fleet expanding by about 10% by 2030. But if the challenges that we just discussed are overcome, you could get about 15% higher capacity online. And one of the first things that policymakers can do to do that speaks to the first point that we were talking about the visibility that hydropower gets. So policymakers need to move hydropower up the policy agenda and make sure that no matter what function you're talking about or which market that you're speaking about it in, that it's really at the forefront of those discussions and not forgotten and not left out, because it does provide a lot of different services and a lot of different roles that it plays. When you talk about building new hydropower in the emerging economies, make sure that those countries have access to affordable financing. And then when you're talking about the existing fleet, make sure that the business case is viable to modernize, to refurbish the existing hydropower. We can't forget about it because it offers a lot of benefits to these markets. Pump storage, like I said, something for everyone, so make sure that the business case is there. And when it comes to developing hydropower sustainably, make sure that developers are using those existing frameworks to help minimize any costs, lead times, or opposition. I'd also say that pricing in the multiple benefits from the water services that hydropower provides is also an area that policymakers can help on, because being able to get a full picture of the benefits that it provides can really make the difference in the investment for hydropower.
Okay. Yasmina Abdelilah, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.